George needed to book the couriers into a hotel where Carlos, Frank, and Carlos's partner, Cesar Tobin, would also be staying. Once the couriers arrived, Carlos would go to their room and replace the imported suitcases with double-bottom suitcases he had brought from Medellin. Each suitcase would contain 6.6 pounds of cocaine. The couriers had to be tanned and beautiful women, preferably unaware of what they were transporting. Their luggage should be stuffed with resort wear and souvenirs from the island. There was to be no fear or anxiety, as customs officials had dog sniffing for smuggling under control. For this endeavor, George enlisted his recent acquaintance Betsy and Frank Shea's girlfriend Winnie. Everything went as smoothly as possible. George drove them to the airport, and Betsy and Winnie flew to Antigua, checked into a hotel, and met with Frank, Carlos, and his friend. 5 days later, the ladies returned to Betsy's house, but without their bags. They didn't want to take 8 pieces of luggage with them on the bus from the airport, so they deposited their suitcases in several lockers at the bus station in Boston. "A bus station in Boston!" yelled George when he heard about it. He later recounted, "The only thing that's really important in the drug business is to stay in control. You always have to be aware of what's going on. At that point, I lost it. $300,000 to $400,000 worth of cocaine that I could be killed for if it got lost. And they left it at the bus station. Those safe deposit boxes were constantly being broken into, and the police would periodically check them with dogs." George took the already remorseful Betsy with him and quickly drove to Boston to retrieve the bags, which were safe and sound. He brought them to Betsy's house, opened all the suitcases, repackaged the cocaine into 1-pound bags, wrapped them with duct tape, and then placed them in heavy waterproof bags. After dark, he took them out to the vacant lot behind the house and hid them in one of the drainage pipes lying in the weeds. One of the rules he'd learned in Danbury was not to keep drugs on your property. If the shipment was seized, the police would have a hard time proving it was yours. After the deal, George was due 11 pounds of product, so he put 2 ounces of cocaine in a plastic bag and drove it to Hyannis, where a known dealer lived. No one was home, so he slipped the bag under the mat by the back door and called the dealer from Betsy's house, telling him he had left a small gift for him to try. Mr. T was an experienced dealer, so he began testing the cocaine the one known way, by melting it on a special tile with a thermometer. Laboratory pure cocaine hydrochloride melts at 195 degrees Celsius. Street diluted coke melts below 100 degrees Celsius, while high-quality powder has a melting point of 160 to 170 degrees Celsius. Mr. T put some of George's coke on his stove and started heating it. The thermometer climbed higher and higher. When the cocaine finally began to melt, the thermometer reached 187 degrees Celsius. George got a call back about 15 minutes later. Mr. T had a hard time keeping his cool. "Gosh, where the hell did you get that thing?" he exclaimed. "That's when I realized we really had something," George recounted. He sold his share to Mr. T and received $235,000, but it was a mere pittance compared to the flood that would soon come. He would eventually have to store the cash in basement air ducts, turning off the heat in some parts of the house to avoid scorching the liquid asset. Later, the cash would be scattered in the walls of the house, dug into the basement floor, and stuffed into hollowed-out holes. George found a new pilot, attorney Barry Kane, who had a private plane. In October 1976, Kane landed his Cessna at Norwood Airport near Weymouth to pick up George, and they headed to Toronto to meet Carlos at the Holiday Inn. Carlos took detailed notes while Barry gave him a tour of the airplane. The Cessna 310 had a fuel capacity of just over 200 gallons and could reach speeds of up to 165 knots. As Carlos had previously explained, the cocaine would be packed in 2.2 pounds bricks, wrapped in cellophane and duct tape, 25 at a time in rubberized bags the size of an army gym bag. The Cessna had a payload capacity of 1,400 pounds, but space would be very tight. Kane figured that if he removed the 2 passenger seats, leaving only the pilot and co-pilot, he could carry 10 or 12 sports bags weighing up to 660 pounds total. The planned air delivery of 100% pure coke was a feat that would bring in a staggering amount of money even by today's standards. One 2.2 pounds brick at the current retail price of $1,000 for 35 ounces would bring in $300,000 per brick, accounting for a 2-1 dilution. With 300 bricks on board, Barry's airplane ride would ultimately generate about $90 million in revenue. For George, this was just his first trip. He had already persuaded Carlos to organize his companions in the forests of Colombia to haul at least once a month, thus selling to the tune of more than $1 billion a year. As haulers, not dealers, George, Carlos, and Barry received a small share of these sales. This suited George just fine, as he often said it was better to let someone else take the risk and get the headache of selling the product. He wanted to manage the pilots and the planes, make travel arrangements, and ensure the goods were safely out of Colombia and delivered within the United States to wherever the Colombians indicated. Carlos convinced his Colombian acquaintances to pay $10,000 for 2.2 pounds, totaling $3 million. Barry wanted $1.8 million of that amount. Not only was he doing most of the work in his own airplane, but he was also bearing the cost of hiring people and bribing officials. George and Carlos agreed to split the rest of the money, amounting to $600,000 each, essentially for making a few phone calls and setting up a couple of meetings. This was 1976, when that amount of money could buy 60 BMW cars. A man with $1 million could legitimately claim to be rich. George saw his own motorized sailboat gliding on the horizon and the beaches and cafes of the Costa del Sol outlined. To pick up the goods, Cain was to fly to an airstrip on a ranch near Medellin, spend the night there while the plane was loaded, and fly out the next day. Carlos acted as liaison. As for the flying part, Cain foresaw a number of interrelated problems, for which he asked for a large share of the profits. His plan was to fly from California to Nassau in the Bahamas, then undetected to Medellin on Friday night. To avoid being spotted, he would signal that he was headed for one of the islands, but instead fly the other way below radar. He would land, load the plane, and return to Nassau on Saturday. Cain had a friend in Nassau named Nigel Bowe, a lawyer who knew everyone in the Bahamas, from the Prime Minister to the head of state SEC security. By paying him, Cain could park the airplane with its cargo at the airstrip in Nassau, leave it there overnight, and fly out the next day. It's only 180 miles to the U.S. from Nassau. The Colombians made $1.85 million for the first time, given the number of kilos sold, the quick result, and the amount of money brought back. George, in his own words, became a golden goose for the Megans. George himself said, "I was a kind of rock star or movie star, almost no different from them. I was a cocaine star." Richard Burial, the same barber, divides the history of LA's cocaine scene into the period before and after George Jung's arrival in the early and mid-1970s. When he switched from marijuana to cocaine, Richard traded mostly in grams due to the scarcity of the product. He would buy a little bit at a time from a courier, a kilo here, a kilo there, then still dilute it all to make a profit, given that the product came to him already diluted. The street coke at the time was 1/3 pure. In the beginning, people didn't distinguish good cocaine from bad cocaine, so it didn't matter. It was just a fashion statement. It wasn't until after George and Carlos that pure cocaine came out and people noticed the difference. That's when the demand started to grow. Burial said it was Richard Burr who was able to organize further distribution of the product after it was transported as a large wholesaler. Richard had 4 dealers to whom he shipped 55 pounds at a time. Demand grew very quickly, not just from consumers. As word of the flights spread through the Colombian community, more and more Medellin merchants began to contract for shipments. George now spent 25 hours a week on airplanes or waiting in airports. He became a local hero among Colombians and earned another nickname, El Americano. Everyone wanted Carlos to introduce them to this guy from Boston and wanted him to do a lot of work for them. But Carlos only wanted this gringo to do business through him. In July, when the demand increased, the pace quickened and the loads doubled. George had a hard time handling it all. He was now hauling 220 pounds a week, so he started renting Learjet planes for $10,000 one way. Then he realized an important thing. When you fly on a Learjet, no one ever asks you anything. They don't know who you are and they're afraid to ask. They just stare in awe. You get off the plane wearing a cashmere jacket and there's a limousine waiting for you. Well, there's another multimillionaire. It's yes, sir, and no, sir. Thank you, sir. Goodbye, sir. You could smuggle in a nuclear warhead and they wouldn't dare stop you. George told me the airplane was the only place he could sleep. He described it as a real nightmare. Money, cocaine, 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 money. Everybody around wanted more and more. Airports, airplanes, everything he had to do brought such pressures. It's no wonder George became tightly hooked on the product he was carrying in the summer of 1977. Carlos later bought the entire island of Norman's Cay to set up a transshipment base for airplanes. George tried to get Carlos back to their original plan, which they had discussed in Danbury, delivering shipments across the border at various points. Some through Mexico to California, others to Louisiana, Florida, and other southern states. The island was a good idea, but my plan was to keep moving, to keep changing, to be stealthy, to be easy on the eyes. No one knows what you're doing, where you are, or who you are. And until they know who you are, they can't catch you, remembered George when talking about their business. George and Carlos had already begun referring to themselves as the company, which they believed included Pablo Escobar, whom George had not yet met, Barry Canane, and several other people. It wasn't called the cartel then, it was the company. My job was to hire the pilots and planes, arrange the landings, and act as vice president of the American side. Carlos was the liaison in Colombia and organized the supplies. That was the initial concept, George recounted. However, trying to rein Carlos in after he settled on Norman's Cay was unsuccessful. Money is power, he said, and he had an unlimited amount of power. George recalled Carlos wanted to use it to liberate the people of Colombia. He said about 87% of all arable land belonged to 12% of the population. Women would sit on the steps of the church and deliberately mutilate their children to make them beggars. He wanted to take over the country and give the people back their land. I told Carlos that power corrupts people, and eventually he would become the man he hated so much. In the end, though, George lost to Carlos's revolutionary rhetoric and simply stopped arguing with him. When a 28-year-old guy tells you he's going to take over the country, what can you say to him? That's what I didn't care about. I wanted one thing. I wanted cocaine and money. That's all I wanted. Carlos wanted a show. I decided I didn't want to see the last act of this play, George said. A few months later, it became apparent that things were taking a bad turn. Carlos begged George to introduce him to Richard Burr and began working directly with him. George went out of business. George now went to parties with Colombians where he was the only American, and the subject of Carlos invariably came up. Everyone discussed what a big shot Carlos had become and how he had swindled George, even though without George, he would not have succeeded. This went on until early 1978, at which point George called Carlos at the Holiday Inn in Nassau, where he stayed when he wasn't on his island, and said he would come over to talk things over. At this meeting, Jung realized that Carlos had changed a lot and that he was no longer in danger. In parting, George threatened, "You're going to pay for this. You and Burr and all the others will answer for this." In the late fall of 1977, George's Colombian wife, Mirtha, rented a house in Eastham, and for the next 9 months, they lived in relative peace until George met a smuggler pilot named Hank and decided to resume operations. In the fall of 1978, he had a daughter, and that same fall, he met Pablo Escobar in person to reestablish the supplies that Carlos had indirectly interrupted. He knew Pablo Escobar through his Colombian wife, and he put his plan into action to establish supplies personally through Escobar by visiting him in Medellin. A couple of months earlier, he had already checked into the Continental Hotel in Medellin, from where he was picked up by Carlos's brother and taken to Escobar's ranch. In addition to strengthening his relationship with Pablo, George cherished a plan for revenge. After all, Escobar knew I was feuding with Carlos. Now I was traveling alone to the heart of the empire. I wanted to show that I wasn't afraid of Carlos. I felt it was a hell of a risk, but I would solidify my status. I guess I wanted to get my respect back. The car drove through the gates of the ranch with the Piper Cub airplane that soon became famous. The car was stopped by bodyguards with guns, and George was escorted down a long dirt road to a large one-story building with a tile roof. George was ordered to wait in the living room and was soon escorted into Pablo's office. Pablo's English was about as good as George's Spanish, and so they struggled to carry on a conversation in both languages. Pablo was gracious and said that he and George had a lot of work to do and that he had a lot of respect for his bravery. The first day at the ranch passed without incident, but on the second day, George saw murder for the first time in his life. A man who had been leaking information to the police was brought to the ranch, and after an angry speech in which George could only make out rata, meaning rat, and maleta, another swear word, Escobar shot him in George's presence. It took George a great deal of effort to keep his composure. Afterward, Pablo said goodbye to George, and George was relieved that Escobar did not consider him a maleta. At the same time, Carlos on the island went completely insane. He forcibly removed all the locals, and those who didn't want to leave were killed. Planes landed and took off almost around the clock. The runway was guarded by about 20 Dobermans kept in pens along it, and bodyguards regularly patrolled the island in their jeeps. George also heard stories of wild sex parties. Prostitutes were brought in from Nassau and Freeport to entertain the local men, running around naked. Carlos himself had recently become addicted to smoking crack cocaine and got high frequently. A little later, George miraculously escaped death by a bomb in his car, most likely planted by Carlos, as this would enhance his reputation among Colombians. George decided to strike back directly at Norman's Cay. He found trusted men and planned to attack the island, but his wife and other Colombians discovered this and began to dissuade George from such a rash act, as it would cause real clan wars. In the late summer of 1980, almost a year and a half after he called off the attack on Carlos, George attracted the attention of the police. Ironically, the situation arose after he had reconsidered his lifestyle and decided to live more modestly. On August 2, 1980, police officer William McGrill took up George Jung's case. He had been tipped off by local East Ham residents concerned about the number of expensive cars on the street. At that time, there were only 15 narcotics officers in the state police, and only 5 of them, like Billy McGrill, worked as undercover agents. McGrill was walking on the private beach at Jung's house until Jung spotted him and asked him to move his boat. George then invited him into the house where he began asking questions, and McGrill identified himself as Billy Sullivan and lied that his wife had recently died and he was looking for a secluded spot on the beach. George and Mirtha took pity on him and allowed him to stop by, so McGrill became George's assistant of sorts. He went with him to the stores, drank, and listened to his endless tales. However, George never said anything that could be used as a basis for arrest. There was no trace of cocaine in the house. Many stories were discussed: trips with cocaine, trips with marijuana, but there were no offenses other than the stories. On August 12, George and Mirtha went to Colombia to see an acquaintance who had a large ranch. They told Billy to watch the house while they were away. They were gone for 2 months, and when Billy met them at the airport in mid-October, they had people with them he had never seen before. One of them was Richard Burr, who had been similarly duped by Carlos and had gone back into business with George. The operation finally moved forward. At the same time, cocaine was delivered to Jung's house, which soon began to be repackaged. That's when the cops, whom McGrill had called in advance, arrived and arrested everyone present. George later recalled the arrest this way: "I was very excited at the time, and it took me a while to realize what was going on. I thought, this is such a small shipment of cocaine. How could you get arrested for this? They didn't know, but there were 100 pounds of cocaine in the chimney and $300,000 in cash behind the medicine cabinet. But then I saw the cops pull 2-year-old Christina out of her crib, and that's when I got sad." The lot was indeed small, but there was still enough in it under the new law for George to be awarded 10 years without parole. The lawyers were able to get him bail, and he hurried to his home in Eastham. George pulled cash from every nook and cranny except for a small traveling money bag. He, Mirtha, and the children took no clothes or other belongings with them, fearing that the house was being watched. He was scheduled for a hearing in front of the Superior Court in the morning, which he had no intention of attending. The last time George had been wanted, he had been young, free, mobile, not even 40 years old, and unencumbered by a wife and 2 children. They traveled to Miami, where, through contacts among Colombians, they found a safe apartment. Mirtha disliked it enormously. She got hooked on crack and hard liquor, and one day set the apartment on fire. George managed to get her and the kids out, but all his bank receipts and forged documents to withdraw money were lost in the fire. To survive this blackout, George found another plane and pilot and arranged to transport 1,100 pounds of Escobar's cocaine from a mountain airstrip between Medellin and the coastal Baronia. Back in America, George was constantly fighting with Mirtha. One night, while driving home, Mirtha started a scandal and began hitting George. He tried to hold on to the steering wheel, but Mirtha wouldn't stop, and he had to break her nose to calm her down. There were 2 police officers in the car right behind them. They were pulled over, and Mirtha started yelling, "He's a goddamn cocaine smuggler! He's wanted by the Massachusetts police! Put that bastard in jail!" George was handcuffed and taken to the police station. "I knew I was in serious trouble for running away, but as far as prison was concerned, I wasn't worried. I knew Mirtha wouldn't bother me there," George recalled. George served a year and a half in Massachusetts. Mirtha also found herself behind bars, but they were eventually pulled out by a lawyer. They went to Florida, where George reverted to his old ways and sold a kilo of cocaine to an undercover agent in the fall of 1983. For Mirtha, that was the last straw. She left George. Jung was facing a serious sentence, but a bag of cocaine disappeared from the evidence room. He was sentenced to 40 months in a maximum security penal colony. At the end of the first year, he was sent to a forest colony in Plymouth, which had no fence at all. It was thought to make prisoners feel better about themselves. George just walked out of there and went back to work. It was 1985. Circumstances had changed in the cocaine business as well. Because of the sharp drop in wholesale prices, George now had to bargain hard to get less than half of his usual transportation fee. But he was no longer young, and he had lost his nerve. George came upon an old buddy of his, a pilot named Cliff, with whom he had once hauled pot from Mexico. What he didn't know was that Cliff had made a deal with the investigation and brought 2 undercover agents with him. For 3 months, George lived on an impounded ship waiting for delivery. When the goods were finally in place, George was arrested again by those he thought were his friends. The agents literally had to wake him up. He had fallen asleep on bags of cocaine. They walked up, pointed their guns at George, woke him up, and said, "George, you're under arrest." George, on the other hand, doesn't remember the agents being so gentle. "I woke up and saw all these guys pointing guns at me. There were about 20 of them coming from all directions, and they looked like they could barely control themselves." The operation was long considered the largest cocaine seizure in the department's history, nearly 1,000 pounds of cocaine. El Americano was taken to the North Dade Detention Center, a county facility that rented out cells to hold federal prisoners. On December 4, 1986, at 1:15 a.m., Carlos Leder was arrested. Rumor has it that Escobar himself turned him in because Leder had finally succumbed to his megalomania, and even appeared on television calling for freedom from the shackles of imperialism. George had a chance for revenge. He was offered a deal, eventually with Escobar's approval. George testified against Leder. The trial held at the U.S. courthouse in Jacksonville can safely be called one of the most colorful events in the city's history. Parking was banned on all adjoining streets, snipers patrolled the roof, and bomb-sniffing dogs walked the hallways. In his 3-hour opening statement to the jury, the prosecutor stated that Carlos Leder had as much to do with the transportation of cocaine as Henry Ford had to do with automobiles. George spent 3 days testifying about Carlos, which took up 564 pages of transcript. He recounted everything from their meeting in Danbury to the altercation in Nassau. The verdict came on May 19th. Leder was found guilty on all 11 counts, including smuggling 7,000 pounds of cocaine into the United States, and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 135 years. Carlos is still alive today. In 2020, he was released from prison and left for his historic homeland, Germany, with the assistance of German authorities. George Jung was released after testifying and traveled with journalist Bruce Porter for a couple of years to the places of cocaine glory. Bruce wrote the book Blow, which became a bestseller, and George received his fee of $250,000 for it. However, he just couldn't stay away from the thrill and took a smuggling job with an old friend. Unfortunately for Jung, that friend worked for the DEA. Jung was arrested again in 1995 and went to prison in 1997. Soon he was approached by a Hollywood director to make a movie about his life. Released in 2001, the movie Blow, starring Johnny Depp, turned Boston George into a celebrity. He was released from prison in 2014, but was later arrested again for parole violation in 2016. He was released in 2017 and never went back to prison again. In 2022, the documentary Boston George, Famous Without the Fortune, was released, in which Jung talks about his hard life and even meets Tuna 40 years later. George Jung died on May 5, 2021, in Weymouth, Massachusetts, of liver and kidney failure. He was 78 years old. Until his death, he enjoyed his last days as a free man with no regrets. For as he once said, "Life is a rodeo. The only thing you have to do is stay in the saddle, and I'm back in the saddle again." Thank you for joining us on this journey through the turbulent life of George Jung and his dealings with the notorious drug cartels. The story of Boston George is a testament to the allure and peril of the drug trade, a world where fortunes can be made and lost in the blink of an eye. If you found this video intriguing, make sure to give it a thumb up and share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, Inside the Secret World of Mafia Titans, and hit the bell icon to stay updated on more gripping mafia stories. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.